Welcome everybody to this week's collective learning meeting co-hosted with the System Dynamics Society's Economics Special Interest Group. Please remember to mute your microphones. The presenters prefer that we hold questions until the end. Feel free to use the chat box. If you type a question there, I, Christine Tang, can ask the question for you. Our presenters today are Aman Ullah and Ivan Taylor. Aman holds a PhD in public policy and is serving as Joint Chief Economist for the Planning and Development Board, Government of Punjab, a provincial government in Pakistan. Ivan Taylor has a PhD in public policy, retired from the Center for Operational Research of Defense Research and Development Canada, and in his retirement started Policy Dynamics Incorporated. Take it away, Aman and Ivan. Oh, Aman, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Avan, should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I think what we have presented during the System Dynamics conference, System Dynamics Society webinar, there was quite a few number of participants, around more than 80. So I think we can make it interactive if there is no problem. You can ask us question if you want during the presentation. And yeah, okay. So hello everyone. I'm Aman, as introduced by Christine, and I'll be presenting the research work on effect of institutional quality on economic growth through
Are you sharing your screen, Aman?
No, I'll start with the video.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So basically, through System Dynamics with my colleague Ivan Taylor, I have been fortunate enough to collaborate with Ivan, who is also my mentor and guide, especially on various joint projects related to public policy. This is what we have been doing, and the ongoing pandemic situation, has given us time to conduct successful one-on-one mentoring sessions. So today we'll be presenting some of the work we have done in the past few months, and I will start my presentation with the 2 minutes video about Pakistan, like how our institutions and economic policies and economic growth is behaving over the past 70 years. Like we got independence in 1947, so it will be giving you some good idea about the presentation which we will be talking about. So let me share my screen here, and yeah, this is the video.
We're not hearing the audio. You're going to have to reset the.
I hear something, but it's very quiet compared to when he practiced before.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So, any problem with the video or
yeah,
audio?
We can't hear the video.
Yeah, it's very low.
Let me do it. Okay.
It's interesting. When we practiced right before this presentation, it was perfect.
Too many plans, too little development. Pakistan's history is characterized by political instability, military coups, wars, external and internal conflicts, international sanctions, natural disasters, energy crisis, and global economic recession that have undermined the proper execution and continuation of development policies. Over the years, these events have resulted in unsteady economic growth, short-lived economic booms, and frequent policy shifts. Over the last 7 decades, despite collaborations with development partners and receiving huge amounts of foreign aid, Pakistan is still far from the stage of self-sustaining economic growth. Pakistan's growth experience suggests volatile annual growth and a declining trend in long-run growth patterns. On the policy side, during the last 2 decades, multiple national development plans were formulated, accompanied by annual development plans and sectoral policies. Almost all plans prepared during the political and military regimes were shelved after change in government. Despite wide circulation of these plans, hardly anyone reads them, understands them, implements them. Hence, broadly speaking, none of these succeeded in getting the desired results. It seems, governments are now more inclined towards projects than policies. Perhaps that is why Pakistan government does not have a comprehensive action plan to improve the living standards of its people for last 3 years. We need to understand that in the absence of our own policies, international donors get space to influence our policy decisions. Ready-made imported policy interventions are not helping us to solve our complex domestic problems. We need to solve our problems on our own, but limited attention is given to demand-driven policymaking to address real public policy issues. To overcome this dilemma, we need to create knowledge networks, bridge the research policy gap, and establish specialized policy platforms at national and subnational levels where stakeholders would interact frequently, share information, float innovative development ideas, learn from mistakes, replicate best practices so as to contribute to the development process more productively and indigenously.
Yeah,
Two
this was the brief video about Pakistan. Now let me share my presentation here. This is my first slide, and I introduce myself and Ivan Taylor. So basically, this is the outline of our presentation. Me and Ivan will jointly present our work today and try our best to address the research questions. Ivan will take over second half of the presentation before we move on to discussion and conclusion session at the end of the presentation. If we move to the third slide, we will try to address the following research questions which we believe are important to address for improving institutional quality and enhancing economic development in like any developing country. And these research questions are like, how does institutional quality affect economic growth? The second question is, how can system dynamics be utilized in economic policy making and management process? And what are the unique contribution of such a model? So these are the three research questions we will try to address during our presentation. And this is like briefly, I'll be giving some idea about the literature review. I have been involved in public policy formulation since the last 15 years in Pakistan. Before like working with the provincial government, I was working with the federal government in Ministry of Planning, Development and Reform. So we are basically, we are responsible for economic planning and management of the province or the country. So hence this subject is very close to my heart, as you can understand. And I'm absolutely convinced that public policy making is the most effective if it is evidence-based and backed by quality data and research. And government policy has always had a significant influence on economic growth and quality of institutions. And moreover, the process of like economic growth and the sources of differences in economic performance across nation are some of the most interesting, important, and challenging areas in modern social sciences. And these are some of the examples from literature review that I would like to share, like the quality of government institution affect the investment and development of a country. This is I'm quoting from the famous paper on institutions and corruption by Nack and Kiefer. It was published in 1995. Similarly, we have like other researchers like Ghaffar Zadigan and Richardson. If we can read from this particular slide in the second bullet, for many public policy problem, a small model is sufficient to explain problem behavior and build intuition regarding appropriate policy responses. And this is what basically we are trying to do. We started with the small model, and then we come up with the like a big picture in our system dynamics modeling. Then similarly, there are some papers there are some references from Schleifer and Vishny, and then finally one senior economist from the IMF, he conducted some research using, these indices from International Country Risk Guide to work on the econometric modeling. Basically, he did some econometric study and analyzed the effect of institutional quality indicators like bureaucratic quality, corruption, perception index, etc., and other policy indicators on economic growth. And he was trying to find the linear relationship between the corruption and economic growth. And what I did during my master's in philosophy when I was doing in Pakistan, so I tried to come up with the growth maximizing level of corruption. So this is what I did using econometric modeling. And later on, I switched to system dynamic modeling in my PhD work. So this is what we will be presenting here during the presentation. And let me move on to the next slide. And this is basically econometric model, the better known models for economic growth, such as the Lewis, Rostow, Harrod-Domer, Solow, Romer, and Barrow, and Stiglitz growth models. And these models of economic growth stress alternative causes of economic growth. And this is what I mentioned about the famous, growth models from the economists. And as I mentioned earlier during my MPhil, I empirically analyzed effect on economic growth through total factor productivity growth and determined the influence of institutional quality within the model. If we talk about these particular equations, like these are just, the regression equations, regression model. Beta bj's or beta j's are the coefficient of the variable, and finally E is the error term in this model. The dynamic feature of the model arises from the inclusion of like lagged dependent variables in econometric models. And if we talk about data collection, I mean, there is lot of good data available with the World Bank, like World Development Indicators. Then we have the data source from International Monetary Fund, which is like International Financial Statistics. Then there are some other sources like International Country Risk Guide. They produced data on economic indicators and other institutional quality indicators. So we have been fortunate enough to access those data sets. And there is another data source, which is World Governance Indicators, and this is produced by the World Bank. So these are the sources we will be using. I mean, we used in our system dynamic model. And in the next slide, I'll be briefly talking about like data conversion, and corruption, income inequality, inflation, and public debt. These are the variables which we converted to make higher values the better. And for world governance indicator, the range is between from minus 2.5 to 2.5. Like minus 2.5 is the low quality, or the incidence of corruption is higher if the value is in minus. And if the value is like 2.5 or positive, it means the country is more clean and less corrupt. And then if we talk about the world development indicators and international monetary fund indicators, I mean, for some of the indicators which I mentioned earlier, we converted to make higher values better. And we can, the data is mostly available for almost all the countries in the world, whether these are developed countries or developing countries. So these are the, I mean, very good sources which can be used to collect data for our dynamic models. And in the next slide, I'll be briefly talking about system dynamic. This is basically our model. And here, if we talk about the system dynamics model, looks at the relationship between almost 16 institutional quality and economic variables, and is primarily interested in how institutional progress can improve the economic growth in a country. So you can look at this is the economic growth, and here we have got institutional quality variables like control of corruption, rule of law, political stability, and absence of violence, voice and accountability. Then we have got some very important, economic indicators like public debt. Then we have got private investment, then government revenue, then the government expenditure or public investment. Then we have got interest payment, etc., etc. These are the variables we have used in our system dynamics model. If we go to the next slide, and each for each institution, we modeled it as a stock, and we used the initial value of 1996. Basically, the initial value is for the year 1996. Then we collected data from 1996 to 2019. These are the data set we have used for our modeling purpose. And the progress was compared between the current value and the initial value. We found the target value for 2019 modified by the progress in other institutions. And we use the classic structure of goals and gaps and balancing feedback. This is what we have used in our this system dynamic model. If you go to the you can tell me if I'm going a bit fast, or doing fine with my speed. And if we go to the next slide, here is an example of a stock and flow diagram for the control of for economic growth. If we let me uh, uh, for economic growth, you can see that we have a stock for for economic growth and progress in the economic growth, which is a function of initial economic control of economic growth and current control of economic growth. And we have a target control of economic growth and a modified target, you can see here, for economic growth, which is modified by progress in other variables like income inequality and control of corruption. And then we have got stock and flow diagram for income inequality. Here you can see, here is an example of stock and flow diagram for the control of income inequality. You can see that we have a stock for control of income inequality and progress in control of income inequality, which is function of initial control of income inequality and current control of income inequality. We have a target control of income inequality and a modified target. Here you can see a modified target of control of income inequality, and which is modified by progress in economic growth and the control of corruption. This is progress in economic growth and progress in control of corruption. Similarly, we have a stock and flow diagram for control of corruption, as I explained previously, for economic growth and income inequality. This is like this particular stock and flow diagram is for the control of corruption variable, or like institution in our model. And yeah, Ivan, I think from here you
Okay.
can take on.
Yeah, as Aman has mentioned, we built our model in Vensim, and then we converted the model to Excel and verified that the model in Excel exactly replicated or duplicated the model in Vensim. And then we used the Excel solver to calibrate the model using the data that we collected from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And then with the calibrated model, we looked at the economic growth projections for various countries and looked at ways to maximize economic growth by possibly expending effort to improve some of the institutions that impact or are related to economic growth. So next slide. So yeah, in the calibration process, we used the solver to minimize the total weighted sum of squared error. And by that I mean we took all of the time series that we had collected from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for the period 1996 to 2019. And we took all of the model estimates of the institutional quality, and we tried to minimize the squared error between the time series and the model estimates over the complete period of time for all of the institutions at the same time. So what we were doing was we were varying the initial values, the progress targets, and the times to make progress to try to calibrate the model. So each of these institutions had different values for these parameters. Next slide. So here's a calibration of control of corruption in Pakistan. And you can see the data in blue and the model in pink. And the next slide shows a calibration of income inequality in Pakistan. Again, the data in blue and the model in pink. And the last slide that I show in the calibration is the calibration of economic growth in Pakistan. And as you saw in that video earlier, there's been a lot of variation in economic growth over the last number of years. And the model sort of takes a conservative approach to the estimation of economic growth. However, notice that this calibration is non-linear, that there's that it's not a linear view of how the growth changes over time. Next slide. So with a calibrated model, now we can run this model for almost any country in the world, and so we ran it in particular for 5 countries, and we projected the economic growth using the calibrated models for each individual country. So we collected data on Pakistan, Mexico, Greece, Iran, and South Africa. And then we calibrated the models individually for each country. And then I'll show you the projections that we were able to develop for each country. We chose these countries because they were in different geographic areas, different continents, and were at different levels of economic development. So this shows our projection of economic growth in Pakistan. And so we see here that the projection is showing a downward decline in economic growth in the future. And this is created by a decline in institutional quality in the number of institutions that impact on economic growth. So the next slide will show the projection for Mexico. And again, we see a decline in economic growth. But now notice that after 2025, our model is projecting an economic contraction, that is negative growth in Mexico. So again, we believe that the institutional quality is affecting economic growth, that there's a decline in institutional quality in Mexico that will continue into the future and create this negative view of the economic growth. Next slide. And Greece has struggled in recent years, and we believe that this has been created by some problems with institutional quality that may continue to have problems in Greece, and we're projecting again of highly negative levels of growth or contraction of the economy of Greece into the future. Next slide. Iran, you can see a lot of variation in Iran, very wild fluctuations in the historical data. Again, we believe that the quality of the institutions in Iran is declining, and this will impact the economic growth and create some contraction in the economy of Iran. And finally, we looked at South Africa, and we again see a declining economic growth created by what we believe is declining institutional quality and negative growth by 2030. Now, the question we ask is can we change this direction and improve the institutional quality by applying policies and turn this relationship around to improve the economy in the future? Next slide. So we approach this using 2 different techniques. The first one was scenarios, where we looked at the possibility of targeted investment in different institutions based on our intuitive knowledge of the importance of those institutions in economic growth, and based on our influence diagrams, our causal loop diagrams, and our stock and flow diagrams. So we felt that that some institutions may need more work than others, or possibly may have more influence than others. And if we could approach those institutions in particular, then maybe we could turn around the economic outlook for the countries. The other approach we had was optimization, where we looked at the possibility of having a finite amount of resources to apply to improve institutional quality. And we looked at trying to find an optimal balance in the allocation of those resources to the various institutions to get the most return in terms of economic growth based on our possible limit of resources of possible policy effort or policy resources. So the next slide shows some scenarios where we were looking at the South African economy, and we were looking to encourage foreign direct investment and control income inequality. So we were applying resources and effort to improve these two institutions, while basically the other institutions were either not there wasn't any extra effort applied to them, or there was possibly neglect of those institutions. So here we see that in the best case, we can, by applying resources to improve these two institutions, we can turn around the economic outlook for South Africa and get the economic growth growing again after 2020. And the expected case is the results I showed you, where there was no extra effort being expended. This was just the situation without any policy changes in the future. And the worst case is a situation where foreign direct investment and control of income inequality are neglected in South Africa, and possibly those institutions actually degrade over time. The next slide shows the results of our policy optimization for South Africa, where we have for zero extra effort, that is basically the current policies or the current level of effort to control or improve the institutions. And we can see that these are values for 2030. And we can see that for no extra effort is applied, if we have policies that are just the status quo, then we will have, we expect negative economic growth in 2030. However, as we apply more effort to improve the institutional quality, and we apply this effort in an optimal fashion, we can start to see improvements in the economy, and eventually we get to a point where if we apply enough effort and improve the institutions enough, we can get to a positive growth rate in the economy of South Africa. However, notice that after a certain period of time, we reach a state of diminishing returns, where applying more effort will have less impact on improving economic growth. So basically, what's happening on the right-hand side of the curve is that we've reached a limit in the ability of these institutions to impact economic growth further. Okay, so that's a summary of our model and how it works. And if anyone is interested, they can contact us and we can try running it for your country. Back to Aman.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. But I'll start from here. Like in the discussion, the slide, I'll just give you some idea like how we can basically run the model. It is necessary to test combinations of policies to select best combination of policies that may help the economies to grow. Like in scenario one, we can have a reduced income inequality. Then in scenario two, we can have like how if we are going to increase government revenue. And in the third scenario we can test with like how we can increase like government expenditure, and how this the model will behave. Then the scenario 4 can be like by increasing private investment, and the 5 can be like improving regulatory quality, and then we have improve institutional quality. And finally in scenarios 7 we can have composite policy, like we can change various indicators or variables simultaneously, and check the effect on our economic growth, which is basically key indicator in our model. And then finally economic growth was trending downwards in all of the countries as examined, as Ivan has shown in the previous slides. And there is a clearer and more stable picture of the growth dynamics. And finally we will come to the conclusion. And here I just want to highlight a couple of points, like development of like system dynamics model of economic growth by incorporating key variables. This is what we have done in this model. And then what we have done, we have developed the model in Vensim, and the translation of the model to Microsoft Excel, and which has had many benefits. And this is what Ivan can show you and tell you like in the end of the presentation. And he like he's very excited to be honest to mention about like how this model will be working using the Microsoft Excel. And then system dynamic models can contribute significantly in policy making process due to various characteristics. Like number one is like they take a feedback approach, then they are aggregated and non-linear, and this is very important thing for economic models. And finally they present simulation runs, and they can examine, I mean these models they can examine the potential trade-offs between alternative policies. And this is what we have basically shown you in our presentation, in graphs, and in causal loop diagrams, and in the big picture of our system dynamics model. And I was so excited to present our work in the special interest group in economics, because by training I'm an economist. Like I have got masters in economics, then MPhil in economics, then I have taken few courses in economics during my PhD. Later on I switched my supervisory panel from economics department to the other department. So that is why I I have started working on the system dynamics model. So and I got all kind of interest in system dynamics, and I have got very good publication in various reputed journals in from my PhD. And I really want to ask this question from the experts here. I mean, the question for the audience, then you can, I mean, later on ask a question from Ivan or and myself. The importance of validity is the central theme of econometric research. And is the typical ST approach efficient in tackling problems of social science research, with less emphasis being placed on empirical validity of ST model? This is the question we just wanted to pose to the special interest group, I mean, on economics. So this is it from our side, and then we can have like comments and questions. So I'm leaving the slide here, or I can stop sharing my presentation, whatever suits you. Christine, you can guide me.
I think it would be nice to see you. I can put the question in the chat,
Okay.
so
Okay.
people can still read it. And I'm not sure who some people in the audience are, so I'm not sure if you are actually the most senior people, most expert in this area. So I'm sorry, professors are busy.
I was expecting, Professor Said and Professor Wright, if they were
Yeah.
able to join us.
Well, hopefully they can watch the video and get back to us, or we can direct questions to them specifically.
Okay.
But one of the things I wanted to just mention that I may have neglected in my presentation was that these pessimistic projections that we're making of these developing countries' economic growth are only projections, and we really we don't believe that these will be the actual results. They're based on the assumption that nothing changes in policies, and so that's why I think this approach is useful, because it can suggest policies that can turn around the trends and get the economic growth growing. And so, like I say, these projections are not cast in concrete. They're not necessarily going to happen inevitably. They are only assuming that the trends in institutional quality continue, and there's no policy effort by the governments to improve the institutional quality. So I think, you shouldn't necessarily come away from this presentation, saying, "Oh my God, the future is heading in a terrible direction." In fact, I think it's very possible that our projections could be very overly pessimistic, and that things could turn around if we can improve these institutions. And we believe that these institutions are very important to support economic growth in developing countries.
Aman, there are a couple of questions. If you can read from the chat, and we can respond.
Christine can read if she's available.
Yes. So one that was sent to me personally was, will you share these slides with others?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Definitely.
Please send it to me. I'll also add it to the YouTube description. Thank you. And then another question is on the SD overview slide. Oh, so would you like to reshare so we can all see this slide again?
Okay.
The causal loop diagram?
Yes. And if you want to ask questions, you can unmute yourself too, but there's some of the ones in the chat I want to ask first. So SD overview, the stock flow. Or no, it was, yeah, causal loop as you said.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was quick. Yeah.
This one. Yes. So this person asked, why do the 4 indicators of institutional quality have that specific feedback? Aren't they interlinked with each other, and don't the others, except the corruption, does corruption affect the economy directly? So,
Ivan?
Well, I think that we tried our best to reflect what we believed was common theoretical basis of the relationships that were developed in econometrics modeling. So we were working from the econometrics formulations to develop a system dynamics view of these relationships. So, but I agree with you that these institutions could change in their impact. We could examine how different connections could be made. And in fact, if you had attended our presentation at the seminar series, you might have recognized that this causal loop diagram is slightly different than the original one we presented in April. And we've added some more loops to it. So we're constantly trying to improve this model. And it's very easy in our software to make these changes to the relationships of the institutions to each other. Basically, you just enter, a value in a matrix to show that this institution is connected to another institution, and the model then regenerates the whole system to reflect that change. So as I said in the presentation in April, we had quite a few, I think, less connections to economic growth, and we added them because we felt that they were also important, and we had neglected them in our earlier formulations of the model. So this is a work in progress. Don't think that this is the final version. We're working to improve it all the time, and in our write-ups, we always talk about limitations of the model and future work. And so at every stage there's limitations, and at every stage there's need for future work. So don't just take this as the final version.
Okay.
So I have a question and a comment.
Sure.
I'm curious about this transfer of the model from Vensim to Excel, and why did you carry the calibration using Excel? That's my first. My second is about, especially with, as you mentioned, about the possible limitations or future improvement of the model. How do you judge the quality of the calibration of the model in terms of replicating the history and then predicting the future? And this one ties to some literature that could be helpful, and maybe you've already looked at, especially at explaining the corruption and rule of law in instability of economic growth. And I think this work is by Saeed Langaroudi, who did his work on Iran. I think if you have looked at that, and also the model of Khalid Saeed of farmers, bandits, soldiers, in terms of how it explains the economic shifts and oscillations. Because what I observed, the calibration doesn't show or the oscillations that seems to be in the economic growth, whereas some of those simple models can replicate or can show how the economy oscillates. I'm not an economist. I just happen to be exposed to that kind of literature, and curious if such such a view is included in your work. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rafa. Yeah, we'll definitely look into those into that literature. I am aware of the soldier, bandit, farmer model. I've primarily used that in work that I was doing on civil unrest in particular. I haven't necessarily applied it in economic growth modeling. Going back to your comment about calibration and looking at the oscillations, yeah, I think the reason the calibration doesn't necessarily reflect the complete oscillation is because we're taking a very long-term perspective of the calibration. So we have done some calibration using political cycles, where we think that there's a possible relationship between the government of the day and the policies they implement to the economic growth. So, for example, when a government changes, they come in with new policies, and those policies could have positive or harmful impacts on the economic growth. And so what we have built a version of this model that takes the changes in government into effect, and we found that leads to a better picture of the oscillating patterns. However, the problem with that model is that we were having difficulty using it to project into the future, because it was hard to determine how the recent government, if there was a recent election, how the recent government policies would impact the future. So we chose to take a long-term view of institutional quality rather than look at the short-term view of institutional quality and the short-term view of economic growth that would be available if we looked at the political cycle. So it's always a modeling choice, to decide, how to calibrate the model or how to build the model. So we had to make choices, and we chose to take the long-term view, which smoothed out a lot of these oscillations, rather than take a short-term view, which we tried with political cycles, which allowed us to have a better calibration of the oscillation, but then it had the fallback problem of not being able to project into the future as in a way that we thought was actually going to be helpful. Does that answer your question, Rafa?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for the clarification.
If you would like to meet with us separately, we can show you our political cycle version of the model, and you can give us your feedback on it and see if you think that approach might be better. But like I say, this model works for any country in the world, and if you can give us, the political cycle for an individual country, we can apply that to and use the data for that country to see if we can get a better calibration.
I think this explanation you did, Ivan, worth another CLM in terms of explaining how this calibration choices are made. I think would be very helpful and educational to go under the hood and show that process, especially in this environment where it's open for learning and sharing.
Yeah. Okay. So we can share it right now if you wish, or we can share it separately on a sidebar, or after the video recording's over.
Yes, we have 7 minutes left, and I believe Al's question was similar to Rula's, so that's why I didn't ask that, but I might be wrong because I don't know about economics. But Al asked, does the model consider the effect of corruption on growth? And I thought that was very similar to what...
No, this is a very good question, to be honest. Like, does the model consider the effect of corruption on growth? I mean, we have taken the indirect route from corruption. If corruption is affecting income inequality, then economic growth. If you look into the econometric model, you can see that in the econometric model, there is a direct connection between the dependent variable is like economic growth, and the independent variable is corruption, income inequality, and all kind of other policy variables. So this is very good point, because like I mean we can take a direct we can take a loop from corruption directly to economic growth, and obviously corruption does affect economic growth directly, and it shouldn't be like doing it indirectly from income inequality. What do you think, Ivan? I mean, this is very good point, and we can further improve the model.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm relying on the theoretical work that was done in econometrics to look at the connections between these institutions. However, I think Rafa's got a good point as well, is we could look at the connections of the institutions that provide the best calibration of the model. So if we turn the question around from, you know, from calibrating the model based on these institutional connections to the other way of looking at it, to finding the institutional links that provide the best calibration, that could be a very interesting way of investigating this problem. Do you understand what I'm saying, Aman?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
I think so. I think, you know, we don't have to just rely on the econometric work. We could actually develop our own theory of the connections of these institutions simply by using our calibration technique and allowing the model to connect the institutions in the way that minimizes the squared error in the calibration process. That would be a fascinating approach. What do you think, Rafat?
I think it's a great point. I think it's a great point.
Al, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
I did just, I think that this discussion goes to the question for the audience that Aman posted, you know, the balance between the short term and the long term. The short term is going to resonate more with a lay audience, we'll call it that, because then they'll see the variations and that's what they're used to. But I understand the point about the long term variation as well. So but then the other perspective is, I would imagine that the SD models, in terms of validity, track very well with any econometric model. So what I've come to understand, believe about SD models is that they have a much greater probability of becoming better. Econometric models are always going to depend on assumptions that are, you know, based on unknown unknowns, and whereas the the system dynamics models become self-improving over time because you're building the system with endogenous variables. So
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about long-term and short-term perspectives, and it's very important point you made, because what I found when I looked at the political cycles and the short term and the inability to project into the long term was that these institutions can take a long time to change. So looking at short term, we just couldn't find ways to improve the performance of the economy in a short period of time. So that's why I said, okay, maybe we really should take a long-term perspective, because like I say, these institutions don't change overnight, and you can try to apply as much effort as you want, and you will not get a short-term improvement in these institutions.
yeah, we just came through a class here at UND where we examined oil policy, and the short story, because we're running out of time, is it all came down to sensors and data indicators, and without those, there's no hope of forecasting these complex variables. So I totally get the point.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it is, as I said, a modeling decision, a choice by the modeler of how he or she wants to formulate the model to to get the most out of the insights you can obtain. And maybe that is a very important insight to bring forward, is this insight that you will have great difficulty changing the direction of the pattern, the trend in economic growth in the short term. So because of the inertia that's built into the institutions. So maybe that's an important insight that we need to bring out in a lot more of a stronger case, and in that way try to get these policymakers to focus on long-term improvements in institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, sometimes it takes extreme creativity to come up with what are these data indicators and the sensors going to be. So, for example, I'll just, based on some recent news stories about Pakistan, the number and the quality of Supreme Court decisions. You know, holy smokes.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, I'm free for the rest of the afternoon if anybody wants to stay, or if we want to set up a separate Zoom meeting. But we can stop the recording now if you want. And feel free to contact me outside of this forum, and we can discuss this in more detail, or other things about system dynamics that you might be interested in.
This is